Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. A bill tabled in the last session of the Lok Sabha seeking to change the way chief election commissioners and election commissioners are selected has created a storm of controversy. But today we ask, has the debate in a critical sense missed the point? Are we wrongly focusing on the absence of a specific individual and failing to focus on the undermining of a key constitutional principle? That is the view of my guest today, the renowned legal scholar and commentator, Gautam Bhatia. Gautam Bhatia, in an op-ed you wrote for the Hindustan Times last week, you said the debate of the government's bill establishing a mechanism for the selection of the chief election commissioner and election commissioners misses the point. The key concern is not whether the Chief Justice is part of the panel or not, but that the process must be independent of the government and not in any sense dominated by the government. Can you explain this central point further, please?
Yeah, so in the Supreme Court judgment in Anup Baranwal, which has been sought to be, in a certain sense, overturned by this bill, the Supreme Court examined the history and the text of Article 324, which provides for the appointment of the Chief Election Commissioner and the election commissioners, and found that the idea behind it was that Parliament would enact a law that would secure the independence of these functionaries from the executive, because the executive is a player in the election game in a parliamentary system. And as a stopgap measure until Parliament would make a law, the temporary arrangement was that the president would make the appointments, which of course means the executive. But Parliament never made a law, and that's the process that was continuing over the years. And the Supreme Court said, therefore, that until Parliament makes a law that, among other things, takes care of this concern about the independence of the Chief Election Commissioner, until that time, the court would provide an interim arrangement. And the interim arrangement it chose to provide was the Chief Justice, the Prime Minister, and the LOP, Leader of Opposition. And that was to hold the field until Parliament passed the law, subject to the rider that the law so passed would, in its own way, ensure the independence of the Chief Election Commissioner through the appointments process. So in that sense, the Chief Justice's presence was not mandatory to the final arrangement. But what was required was that whatever the arrangement would be, it would secure independence. And that's what's not happened with this bill.
Let me pick up on that point because I think that is the key issue. For the benefit of those who have not read the Supreme Court's judgment in the Anup Baranwal case, can you explain why the Supreme Court believes that if the executive appoints the CEC or the ECs, it would be incompatible with the independence of the Election Commission? Because the truth is, the executive does appoint other constitutional authorities like the Controller and Auditor General, and they are deemed nonetheless to be independent. Why would it be different in the case of the EC or the CEC? That's the key point, isn't it?
Yeah, so the court looks at the role that the Election Commission plays and at its increasing and expanding responsibilities and powers over the decades since independence. and finds that it plays a crucial role in actualizing the right to vote. So it links the right to vote and the Election Commission. The Election Commission provides the infrastructure that makes the right to vote effective and real. And therefore, given its role as effectively mediating between the executive and the citizens when it comes to implementing the right to vote, its independence from the executive is particularly important, in a certain sense, more important than a body like the CAG. It's something, although of course the court doesn't say it, it's something akin to the court itself, in the sense of the role it plays and its task in making a very crucial right viable and accessible. So for that reason, the Election Commission is placed on a pedestal that's a little higher than a body like the CAG.
Tell me, in the debates in the Constituent Assembly, which reflect the thinking behind Clause 324, which determines the Election Commission's position in the Constitution, did those debates specifically say that the Election Commission should be independent of and not dominated in its process by an appointing mechanism that is led by the government? Is that part of the debates?
Yeah, they say so specifically. And as I said, the problem is that a constitution cannot lay down everything. So a constitution can set out the broad principles, but the minutiae and the specifics have to come through parliamentary legislation. And therefore, the constitution can't, in its text, lay down detailed, appointment procedures, which is why you leave the job for parliament, you lay out the principal framework. And then, of course, Parliament's law must comply with that principal framework. So,
in a sense, the debates in the Constituent Assembly give a clear indication of what the founding fathers of the Constitution intended and wanted to happen.
Yeah, they do. So that's quite clear. And again, if you look at other constitutions, more recent constitutions like South Africa or Kenya, they have these bodies placed in a specific part of the constitution, chapter 9 institutions they're called, or something, or integrity institutions. And in those constitutions, the text explicitly says that they will be independent, and then the details are with legislation. So that's a common model followed across the world.
In your article for the Hindustan Times, you point out that in most constitutional democracies, election watchdogs are considered what are called fourth branch institutions. What happens in major parliamentary democracies like the United Kingdom and Canada? Are there degrees of separation between the executive and these fourth branch institutions?
Yeah, so across the world, that happens, and it happens in one of two ways. Either the process is made non-partisan or it's made multi-partisan. So by non-partisan, you exclude, what you consider political bodies, and by multi-partisan, you have a broad representation of stakeholders across the board. So, for example, in some countries, you would require parliamentary ratification of election commissioners by supermajorities. In other countries, what you would have an appointments committee, much like a judicial appointments committee, that would have representatives from the executive, from the opposition, from civil society, with the structure being that no one stakeholder could have a veto or dominate the process. So in that sense, and this is something that interestingly you see in para 107 of the concurring opinion by Justice Ajay Rastogi, where he makes a table of how other countries, various countries do this, and finds that India is quite the outlier so far in granting this power to the executive. We've had it for all these years, but we are the outlier. So that shows that this is not how most countries do things.
Let me put at this stage some of the other comments made about this issue and see how you respond to them. First, does the fact a search committee headed by the cabinet secretary and comprising two other senior secretaries will put forward a panel of 5 candidates to the committee headed by the prime minister reduce the concerns we're discussing, or does it make no difference whatsoever because the prime minister's committee can at the end of the day consider anyone it wants, whether that person is recommended or not?
Yeah, so this is one way that has been used across the world to try and reduce the influence of the executive. So, for example, if you look at appointment of judges, in countries like South Africa and Kenya, the shortlist is given to the executive by a different body, and the executive then can pick, idea being that the executive's role is downstream and not upstream. So that has been a way that's been used, but in this case, the body itself is not representative in that way. So the shortlist itself in that way is problematic, and as you said, ultimately they can pick whom they want. So in that sense, it formally creates a separation, but substantially its impact might be minimal.
Now, former Chief Election Commissioner S.Y. Qureshi has argued that one possible reason why the government has not included the Chief Justice in the appointing panel is because if there is a challenge, it would automatically go to him and there could be a conflict of interest. How do you respond to that?
There are two things. One is that in practice, the way it will happen is that the Chief Justice or his or her nominee will be the third party in the committee. If then there is a challenge, the number 2 judge in the Supreme Court will be the one who will handle the assignment. So Chief Justice will recuse and it will go to number 2. Number 2 will then decide which judge of the Supreme Court or which bench hears the challenge. So formally you have that separation. But I think functionally, it doesn't make sense because judges of the Supreme Court obviously are collegial, they know each other very well. So it will be awkward for the court to hear a challenge against a selection that is made by its head. It'll be awkward. So I think that in that sense, I didn't agree initially when the judgment came out that the interim arrangement should be like this. I thought that it was causing needless controversy to have the Chief Justice there, and they could have found something a little more, multi-partisan to have that interim arrangement. So I think that was perhaps, in my view, not the way to go. And I think that the objection that Mr. Qureshi has raised, as I said, it's not formally there is separation, but in substance, I think he's correct.
Now, another suggestion from Mr. Qureshi is that if the government refuses to change the composition of the panel, which includes both the Prime Minister as well as another minister appointed by the Prime Minister, then the selection should be unanimous. This would, in fact, give the leader of the opposition an effective veto over any partial or any one-sided candidate that the government wants to push through. How do you respond to this idea of it has to be unanimous, it can't be by majority?
I think that's a fair suggestion. But I think that the problem remains that the selection bodies is too small and too tiny and doesn't really reflect, as I said, the multi-partisan character of this election. So in general, there is wisdom in, given that the election commissioner is the referee or the umpire between the opposition and the ruling party when you go to polls, it does make sense to have consensus, much like, as you know, in arbitration, normally one party picks one, the other party picks the other, then the two together pick the third. So you have that way of having both parties on board. So I think that's a valid answer, but I think that also it would be good to have a more wide-ranging committee that would bring in more people with a wide range of experience than just, Prime Minister, LOP, Minister.
Would I be right in sensing that your personal preference would be what you call a multi-partisan body, which has not just a representative of the government and the opposition, but other learned, informed people from various branches of civil society?
Yeah, I think that would be a good way to go. What its shape takes, of course, is Parliament to decide. I think that line is a good line to go down.
Now, as things stand, we have, in fact, a 3-person body, 2 from the government, the PM and a minister, and 1 from the opposition, the LOP. And this clearly not only conflicts with, but defies the spirit of the Constitution, which is that the Election Commission should be separate from the executive, not appointed by the executive, not subservient, therefore, to the executive. That being the case, what would happen if the government's bill, if it's passed, gets challenged? Is it likely to be struck down by the Supreme Court because it defies the central core concern, the independence of the Election Commission?
I think it should be struck down, but predicting Supreme Court judgments is a mug's game. So I'm not going to say what might happen. I think it should be struck down.
It would be consistent and logical for it to be struck down. It would be somewhat surprising because it would go against the Anup Baranwal case logic if it weren't struck down. Is that a correct way of putting it?
I think, yeah. I think it should be struck down because the Anup Baranwal logic is based on constitutional principles, which haven't been, of course, overridden, even though the judgment itself its foundation has been altered in that way, in that its selection committee has been altered. So in that way, the judgment's been overturned. But the constitutional principles of independence and operational and structural independence remain. And those still would have to govern the content of any proposed law, which I think this proposed law does not comply with. So I think it should be struck down. In my view, it would be correct, legally correct for it to be struck down.
Now, Mr. Bhatia, there's one further problem. If the bill is passed and becomes an act and then it's challenged, the Supreme Court could take years to actually respond to that challenge. That is precisely what happened in the case of Article 370. It's happened in the case of electoral bonds. It's happened in the case of the Citizenship Amendment Act. If it were to happen in this case as well, would that not mean that effectively it would be a fait accompli? Because you would have, in the meantime, had election commissioners and CECs appointed by a body dominated by the government. They would in turn have presided over elections. They may well have delivered rulings that are questionable. And therefore, 4 or 5 years down the road, you'd already had governments elected and majorities handed out, which perhaps were questionable.
Yeah, I think that if it's challenged, then it's a case that should be heard on an urgent basis, because it effectively is about the rules of the democratic game. And given that the legitimacy of governments flows from the electoral game and ensuring that the rules are refereed and umpired impartially and neutrally, any departure from that, of course, is a problem. And the Supreme Court's and the judiciary's role, one of their primary roles, is to be a guardian of that process. So I think that if it's challenged, then it would hopefully, and it should be something that, at least when it comes to the question of a hearing for stay or not stay, the first hearing, that should at least, I hope, be taken up on an urgent basis.
One more point, and this time I'm not talking about constitutionality, I'm really talking about political morality. How do you view a government that wants to dominate the mechanism for appointing the chief election commissioner and other election commissioners? Doesn't that blatantly defy the spirit of democracy and speak volumes about the attitude of the prime minister and his or her government to this key concern of fair play?
I think every government has done that in our history, which is why Parliament never passed a law that it was supposed to pass. And I think that the point is that every political executive, to different degrees, tests the boundaries of what is constitutionally permissible. It keeps trying to push those boundaries and keeps trying to expand its power, and then see how other bodies react. And the job of the other bodies, Parliament and the courts in our case, to respond. And of course, for various structural reasons, Parliament is not in a position to respond, which leaves the courts. So I think that in that sense, this is not just true of India, but across the world, the executive is always trying to play what they call constitutional hardball to see how far it can go. And it's other bodies' job to then keep it in line. And so I place the responsibility over there.
Which also suggests that there would be an incumbent duty on the Supreme Court to stand up for something that the executive is trying to circumvent, and to do so expeditiously rather than by delaying it by years.
The court's task is to police the sort of boundaries of the electoral process and ensure that it complies with the constitutional requirements, and to do so in a timely fashion.
In the article you wrote for the Hindustan Times, you said the present mechanism proposed by the government for selecting CECs and election commissioners is tantamount to a player in a football game wanting to choose the referee for that game. And that, in a sense, sums it up. This is why it's so critical that this bill be either not passed but amended first, or that if it is passed, the Supreme Court step in quickly and once again assert the independence of the Election Commission.
Yeah, so and as I said earlier, it's either the referee is appointed by a body that is free from influenced by players, even though players can have a say. So players can veto particular referees they think might be biased towards one side or the other. Or both sides come together and agree that this will be our referee. And if you translate the two into the constitutional domain, that's what you get, what I've been saying, multi-partisan or non-partisan. So it has to be one of the two.
Mr. Bhatia, thank you very much for this enlightening interview.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.